Welcome to Digging In, a new podcast from SiteNews. I'm your host, Russell Hixson, and this week, for our first ever episode, I'm speaking with economist Jock Finlayson, and we're popping the hood on the Canadian economy and seeing which gears, springs, cogs are having the most impact on construction. So let's get into it. It's an interesting time to be an economist. It's been a very turbulent, wild few months. We're talking about tariffs today a little bit. And I know Trump believes that it is the most beautiful word in the English language. Do you concur?
I don't, and I'd love to know what the origin of his affection for tariffs is, but he's believed it for a long time, actually. He's been talking about tariffs, trade, long before he got into politics, when he was a real estate mogul in New York. And he has this strange view of tariffs as a sort of all-purpose vehicle that a big country like the United States can do to force other jurisdictions to bend to America's will. And that's what he's trying to do right now, not just with us, but with almost everybody. And my own view is it's not going to work, even from an American perspective. But in the meantime, it creates a lot of turbulence, to use your word, and frankly, damage to the economy, including the American economy, which is actually being hit harder than most others by the president's policies. So it's a certain irony in that.
So we recently had the G7 in Alberta, and it appears that there's some kind of 30-day deadline. Prime Minister Carney and President Trump are looking to make a trade deal, and it also looks like they secured some kind of deal with the UK, although it's not all the tariffs going away. How optimistic are you going forward in these next 30 days that maybe we can reach some kind of agreement?
I'm actually quite optimistic that we're going to reach a resolution of the current uncertainty. And the uncertainty is what's really hurting us at the moment. And we can get into that a little bit later. But the actual tariffs that have been imposed on our exports by the U.S. and then reciprocally by Canada on goods imported from the United States, there have been some, but not across the board on all of our trade by any means. And this is different. This puts Canada in a different position than a lot of other countries that are looking at either current or potential across-the-board tariffs, whether those are 10% or 20 or 40. So far, Canada has escaped that. And I think that's partly due to the protection we get from the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, which, of course, is Trump's agreement. He insisted that the NAFTA free trade agreement in North America be renegotiated. He said it was a terrible agreement. And then it was renegotiated in his first term. And he said it was the best agreement that anybody had ever negotiated. So I think maybe I don't know if he still believes that, but perhaps he feels some attachment to it. The other thing is, in the long run, I think America's big strategic challenge is China. And this is the view of a lot of the people in the U.S. and the national security establishment. It's the view of a lot of Republicans in Congress. I don't know if it's Trump's view, but some of the people around him have certainly espoused it. And if China is your main competitor and your rival for global economic and technological and military leadership, then countries like Canada can actually be allies as you try and position yourself to compete with China. We're not really the problem. We could be a potential buttress for America's efforts. And I think that message is probably getting through to some extent in the people around Trump. So I believe whether we get it done in 30 days along the lines of the Prime Minister's statement yesterday or the day before, 30 days, 40 days, 60 days, who knows? But getting through this period of uncertainty and getting some kind of an agreement with the U.S., I think, is really essential for Canada, because the uncertainty is really hurting investment and even consumer confidence, and it's really thrown sand in the gears of the Canadian economy. So we need to get through this, and what it looks like on the other side, I'm not sure. But I think we have a decent chance to avoid across-the-board American tariffs, which would be, with this president, that would be a good outcome.
Let's talk about that uncertainty for a little bit here. Some of these tariffs have been in effect for a little while. What has been some of the impact on the Canadian economy and the construction sector specifically?
Well, America has most over 80% of what we sell in the United States at the moment is still not facing tariffs. So it could be worse. But steel, aluminum, 50% U.S. tariffs. The non-U.S. content of assembled vehicles produced in the auto industry in Ontario that are shipped to the U.S., they're facing a 25% tariff just on the non-U.S. content. We have lumber tariffs. Those predate Trump, though, and those are based on countervailing and anti-dumping duty actions that have a long history. But the rest of Canada's exports to the U.S., provided the exporters comply with the paperwork requirements of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement, can enter the U.S. tariff-free. So we're not facing across-the-board tariffs. But the industries I mentioned, particularly steel and aluminum, steel especially, but all the industries that are facing U.S. tariffs obviously are being squeezed. And so we're seeing layoffs in the steel mills in Ontario. We're seeing layoffs in some of the auto assembly plants in Ontario as well. Ontario is taking a lot of the pain here. I haven't heard about aluminum companies in Canada laying people off yet, but we'll have to wait and see. So those industries are hurting. The general business community is unclear what's going to happen. There's, again, all this uncertainty. So I think a lot of companies across the whole economy are sitting on their hands right now. They're not making decisions. They're not committing to substantial capital spending commitments, programs. And we are seeing total Canadian exports to the U.S. falling. So we saw that in April. The first quarter of the year, they actually went up because a lot of people were buying to get ahead of the tariffs that they feared. But April, we saw a substantial drop in Canadian exports to the U.S., which, if it continues, could actually push our economy into recession. So that's the U.S. tariffs. We've also imposed our own tariffs, retaliatory Canadian tariffs on steel, on some other building materials, some other consumer goods. And I understand why our politicians feel they have to do that, but it actually compounds the economic damage to our own country, because not only are we facing a squeeze on our ability to export certain items into the U.S., we're raising the cost of goods for Canadian households and businesses. So at the very time your economy is taking a hit on the export side, you're actually raising costs and raising prices domestically through retaliation. So when the Prime Minister met with President Trump shortly after taking power, winning the election, he actually paused some of the tariffs that were retaliatory Canadian tariffs due to come into effect. So I think that was a good move. I think this sort of tit-for-tat retaliation regarding tariffs with the United States is not a very good place for Canada to end up. I think we need to be smarter and more strategic in how we approach this. And if consumers want to boycott American goods and stop traveling in the U.S., to me, that makes more sense as a form of retaliation, rather than raising our own prices and costs for our own businesses, including construction. So it's at ICBA, we're of the view we shouldn't be retaliating in ways that raise the cost of building things, whether it's housing, infrastructure, commercial buildings, whatever it may be, because it's already expensive enough without doing that.
So you've been critical of retaliatory tariffs. What about some of the other responses? I know there's been some buy Canadian, like you said, movements. Different provinces have talked about changing their procurement policies to prioritize Canadian vendors, Canadian businesses. What are your thoughts on some of the other ways, like you said, that we can deal with these tariffs other than just, hitting back with other tariffs that kind of squeeze people from both ends?
I think the other mechanisms are better. They're less damaging to our own economy. If consumers want to change their behavior because they don't like what the United States is doing on trade policy, that's up to them. I mean, we live in a free society. People choose how to deploy their household budgets. So that's good. Procurement, I can see there is some sense, I think, in governments, municipal governments, provincial, federal governments having a fresh look at their procurement policies as maybe a way to retaliate against the U.S. without raising our own prices and costs on our side of the border. That it's the latter that I really think is important to avoid because it's quite damaging to the Canadian economy if we, through our own policies, raise the cost of doing business and raise the cost of household goods in Canada. We should really be trying to avoid that, in my view.
Now, could there be some silver linings to this? I know, at least for the construction sector, it seems to me like there's been a renewed interest in large resource projects, large kind of trade-enabling infrastructure. It seems like the public, projects that they maybe wouldn't have supported in the past or people wouldn't have thought about, it's kind of front and center. Even Mark Carney is talking about nation-building projects. Could this be a silver lining to generate more support for maybe some of these large construction projects that maybe otherwise wouldn't have gotten as much attention?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it does, the Trump has kind of shocked Canada and a lot of Canadian citizens and maybe some of our leaders out of their complacency because, before he came along, most people weren't contemplating the prospect of a trade war with a country that we sell 75% of our exports to, and where we source 2/3 of our imports. I mean, it wasn't something that people were expecting. And the kind of language that he's used around supposedly America subsidizing Canada, he says $200 billion a year. I've yet to figure out how he generated that number. And even musing that wouldn't it be nice for Canada to become a U.S. state. I think these have been shocking kind of developments for a lot of Canadians, and even maybe some of our political elites. So they are talking in Ottawa and even Victoria here and other provinces. They're talking a different game than they were 6 months ago, and it's more focused on building the country, investing, trying to speed up decision-making on projects, everything from infrastructure to concrete condo towers in, Vancouver or Victoria. And that's good. So that if that continues and if it leads to action, then I think we could say that was a silver lining of the Trump era. I wouldn't go so far as to say he's done us a favor, but I think he may have jarred us out of our sort of sleepy complacency that this country has been, in my view, enveloped in for, a decade or more.
Now, you mentioned some of the inflammatory statements that President Trump has said about, annexing Canada and all these things. And I believe Carney has talked about how our relationship with the U.S. has fundamentally changed. So I think even if, we reach some kind of trade deal going forward, things could be different. What could we do going forward to insulate ourselves from potentially more tariffs? I mean, who's to say that in the next 3 to 4 years, Trump might try another squeeze to get us to do something? Are there ways that Canada can insulate its economy from this kind of tactic?
Yeah, I think you're right to point out that even if we get a deal with President Trump in, by the end of the summer, for example, but as long as he's in office, there will be this kind of menacing uncertainty about what's next, or is there a risk of some other rupture in the relationship? So I think the Prime Minister is right to say that getting a deal with the U.S. doesn't mean we go back to where we were in 2024. This period is going to have, I think, some lasting consequences, and so. You talk about insulating ourselves from the U.S. We're talking about a matter of degree here. I mean, we are so tightly intertwined. We are so dependent on the American economy, the American market. 1/4 of Canada's total national income is based on trade and commerce with the United States. And yes, we can diversify. And, Premier Eby just got back from 10 days in Asia. After he was sworn into office, Prime Minister Carney, his first foreign trip was to Europe. And these are these are initiatives that make sense, but no one should be under any illusion that we can redirect our trade through the statements of politicians away from the historic tight connection that exists across the border. The U.S., in economics, we talk about what's called the gravity model of international trade. And what it basically says, when you strip everything out, it says the intensity of trade depends on proximity above all else, because and then when you combine a common language, so we have absolute proximity. The 90% of the Canadian population is within 150 kilometers of the border.
Well, right now we're 20, 30 minutes from being in the U.S.
And the U.S. is a $30 trillion economy. In Canadian dollars, it's more than 40 trillion. We're 3.3 trillion Canadian dollars. So it's 25% of the entire global economy, and it's right next door. And we've got very tightly connected supply chains and business relationships, family, personal relationships. I went to school in the U.S. I mean, I don't think of the U.S. as my home, but I'm very knowledgeable about it, and I pay a lot of attention to it. And I think many Canadians are in the same boat. But that power of the size, the wealth, and the proximity of the American market is not something we can replace. So although we can diversify, and we should be looking at selling our energy and LNG and critical minerals and other goods to Asia and Europe, and we do already, but we could do more, we're not going to transform the Canadian economy into something that is no longer heavily dependent on the U.S. It's not going to happen, which is why it's so important that we find a way to stabilize the relationship, the political relationship, the commercial relationship, and the defense and security relationship. Not because they want it, because we need it. That's why we need to do it. So I think, we live in a market economy, and trade, politicians can go on trade missions, they can give speeches, they can even pass legislation, they can even negotiate trade agreements. But at the end of the day, trade reflects what business is doing, what entrepreneurs and companies are doing, who they're transacting with, how they're configuring their supply chains, which markets they're prioritizing, how they're organizing their business, where they put their plants and production centers, the business strategies they use to compete and survive and innovate. These are all choices that companies, boards of directors, investors make. Governments have relatively little role in all of that. And so I'm not a believer that we can rapidly and significantly diversify away from the United States. At the margin we can, but we're talking like a few percentage points of our trade, maybe over 10 years, we can shift away from the U.S. We are not going to shift most of it or even much of it.
So it's kind of like your family. You're kind of stuck with them.
Well, we are. It's been a good situation for Canada historically, in the sense that as America has thrived in the world and become the world's biggest, most productive economy, there have been spillover benefits for Canada as the tightest, closest trading partner. But it does leave us vulnerable to shifts in U.S. politics and the arrival of what I would describe as kind of erratic policymaking that certainly we see under President Trump. So it is concerning, but we have to muddle through. We don't really have an alternative to the U.S.
So speaking about this relationship with the U.S., how shocking is this? Is this a very large departure from our normal trading relationship? I know Trump did some steel tariffs a while back.
First term,
and then I know
and aluminum too,
and I know there has been kind of a bit of a protectionist bent to some American politics. Is this a large departure, or do you think the U.S. has been maybe moving in this direction and Trump has just kind of thrown some gasoline on it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, it's sort of yes and no is my two-handed answer. There is a larger shift, I think, in American policy with respect to trade and the outside world. And it didn't start with Trump, but his first term as president, it really began to congeal. And it's striking that President Biden, in his 4 years, more or less kept the Trump apparatus in place when
Yeah.
it comes to China. In fact, he went further than Trump did to try and decouple or reduce American dependence on China. He didn't do much vis-a-vis the other U.S. allies. He wasn't threatening in the way that Trump has done, but strategically, Biden and I think both parties, and this is a big deal for Canada. I think Prime Minister Carney really has this in mind when he says something has shifted, and it's that the American consensus around the U.S. role in the world, U.S. approach to trade policy, the U.S. appetite for economic integration has really changed. And the Americans have become more nationalistic, more mistrustful of China and maybe some other foreign jurisdictions. COVID shocked a lot of people into taking a fresh look at their supply chains, how resilient they are, who do they depend on for critical goods. And you probably don't want to be depending on your adversaries. Mind you, we're not an adversary of the United States. So I think that's a bigger, more strategic shift in American thinking that will outlast Trump, although he is certainly an accelerator of it. So I think we need to take note of that, and probably in our policy toward China, for example, and I think we're seeing some moves in this direction, because we need the United States as our biggest customer and we don't want to put that in jeopardy. We need to align with the U.S., I think, vis-a-vis China, especially in terms of trade, but also security and defense. A lot of Canadians will say, no, I don't want to do that, but it's in our own national interest to do it. It's certainly in our economic interest. But Trump, so it's a paradox in a way, because Trump he didn't create everything that's going on right now. He's kind of surfing on the waves that were already there, but he's also whipping the waves up to be even more ferocious than they were before. So he's an historic figure from that perspective.
Yes.
But he's not creating something out of nothing. It's not just Donald Trump's idiosyncratic beliefs and personality that are driving everything. They're playing a role, to be sure, but underneath that, I think there's a deeper rethinking of America's place in the world. So, and I think, Prime Minister Carney, I think that's what's kind of in the back of his mind when he says we need to reset relations on trade, defense, and other things.
Well, I agree. I think even if you remove Trump from the scenario, I think the American sentiment, and even, some Democrats, there's a more protectionist kind of attitude in America.
And more Republicans, which is a bit more surprising. But, the argument I would make, and I think Canada's been trying to advance this with mixed success with the Trump administration, is, look, we're not your problem, really, at the end of the day. I mean, Canada, yes, we run a trade surplus with the U.S., but it's not very large. It's $30 billion a year. The U.S. economy is $30 trillion U.S. dollars, $40 trillion Canadian dollars. America's overall trade deficit is $1 trillion. We're like a very, very small part of that. They run a much bigger trade deficit with China and also with Germany and Japan. So I think the argument to the United States that we should be making is, look, we're part of this integrated North American market and economy that your agreement, your Canada, U.S., Mexico agreement recognized and solidified, and we should be collaborating. If you want to build a fortress North America to become less reliant on China and others, we can work with that, and we can actually help in achieving it because we are a huge energy producer. We've got one of the best reserve positions in minerals and metals of any country in the world. We're a huge agricultural producer. We've got water, although Canadians don't like to talk about water, and we have a shared interest in the security of North America as a whole. So that, to me, like, we have a lot we can work with on those issues, and I think we're going to have some success with that, even though Trump's language sometimes makes you wonder. But I think incrementally he's coming around to see it that way also, and our government has to help him get there.
Let's look inward. I think something that's come up a lot are interprovincial trade barriers, and some have been strongly pushing to tear those down. Maybe explain some of the strategy behind this, and why do we even have some of these barriers?
Yeah.
Because I think this is something a lot of people don't know
Yeah.
about. Like there's some places where you're not supposed to go across the provincial line and buy beer and come back.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Canada is what some economists would call an imperfect economic union, in the sense that we don't have a single seamless integrated national marketplace. And the reason for that, there's two reasons. I think one is just the geographic expanse of the country. And if you've traveled all across Canada as I have, it is quite striking. So there are distinct regional markets and economies and ways of doing business and so on. But the bigger reason is under the Canadian Constitution, the provinces have a lot of power in areas that can affect interprovincial trade and commerce and mobility. What do I mean by that? 90% of the labor force in Canada falls under provincial jurisdiction. That is labor law, employment standards, occupational licensing and certification, professional licensing and accreditation, the occupational health and safety system, which we call WorkSafe BC in British Columbia. Those are all under the control of the provinces, not the government of Canada. So each province has its own constitutionally mandated authority over many, many areas of policy affecting labor mobility and accreditation and all of that. So that's a big deal. So, I mean, imagine if we had one license across Canada for everybody who was a nurse, an electrician, a welder, a physician, an architect, an engineer. That would be better than what we have now, right? But we don't. We've never had that, and the provinces do have the authority. There's also procurement. You mentioned it a few minutes ago in relation to the United States. Well, provinces are big players in the economy. They procure hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods and services every year for government ministries, for the education system, universities, healthcare regions, everything. I mean, these are all provincial. And so they're buying enormous amounts of goods and services. And many provinces have built in preferences for local suppliers. So saying, if we're going to buy, diapers or IT services, or even if we're going to procure construction services, we're going to have a preference for local suppliers. A lot of people think that's a good idea, and maybe it is, but it does serve to fragment, the Canadian market, because you've got these big government-mandated, government-controlled parts of the economy that are not procuring goods and services in the way a business would, which would be just looking for the lowest cost and the highest quality.
It's not completely open.
It's not completely open. We also have restrictions. Provinces have monopolies over liquor distribution, and so that historically has led to challenges around getting wine and other spirits produced in one province sold in another. We have different trucking regulations. We have different. Look at climate policy. My goodness, we have a national government under Mr. Trudeau, and we'll see what happens with Carney, that prioritized climate policy. They brought in hundreds of new programs, policies, regulations, and the same thing's happening provincially. So you've got this very complicated kind of patchwork across Canada of different, clean fuel standards, building codes, step codes, different approaches to regulating electricity industries, because those are fall under the jurisdiction of the provinces. So historically, as the size of government has expanded in the economy, and that's part of what's going on here, you've had more and more differentiation across the country in how the provinces approach these things. So the idea is that this throws sand in the gears of commerce on a national level. It raises costs. It makes it harder for Canadian companies to grow. A lot of Canadian businesses will say it's easier doing business in the U.S. than in the province next door. I don't know to what extent that's really true, but you do hear it. And so the idea with these interprovincial barriers is if we can reduce those or even get rid of them, we'll create a more seamless national kind of marketplace, and that this will allow companies to grow. It'll drive down costs. It'll make us more productive. I buy all that. I think it's good. It's one, Trump's done us a bit of a favor, and he's opened the door for us to take a fresh look at this. And there seems to be a sort of political commitment to move on it. It's not a silver bullet quantitatively. It doesn't remotely offset our reliance on the American market. So it's not as if we can cut back on trade with the United States by 50% and make up for it by dismantling interprovincial barriers. The upside benefits of dismantling internal barriers are real, but they're relatively small. Whereas the upside benefits of being able to trade openly with the United States are huge.
It often feels like we're living in these unprecedented times, but when we look at kind of the broader sweep of economic history, are there long-term and short-term cycles that might help explain some of the things that we're going through? And are there any lessons that maybe could be learned from that?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. I've been too busy with the here and now. But
Yep.
there are believers in these kind of long wave cycles. I'm not somebody who thinks that way, and I haven't really studied, that part of economic history. Earlier generations that are no longer with us in our country, fought in World War I and II, lived through the Depression. As turbulent as today's times seem, our ancestors have gone through worse. So I think it's wise to keep a sense of perspective in that regard. So lessons, though, we went through, coming out of World War II, especially, we had sort of 50 years of what some economic historians would call globalization. So this is countries getting increasingly involved in trade and commerce outside their borders. So trade was growing faster than economic output. So the ratio of trade to GDP was kind of inching higher for most countries. Supply chains became more far-flung and spread out and complex as companies tried to access cheaper goods and built market share in other jurisdictions. Foreign investment flows increased as a share of total investment happening in a lot of economies, including our own. People traveled more outside of their own jurisdiction because of, the availability of air travel and so on. And in the last 20 or 30 years, we've had the information explosion, the ICT revolution, the digital economy, which has allowed absolutely momentous amounts of information and knowledge to cross borders, like in the blink of an eye, which, is a big deal. We didn't, 50 years ago, you had to write it down and mail it, So all those things have fostered globalization and greater global integration. But I think, with looking at Mr. Trump and look what's happened in Europe and elsewhere, China, I think a lot of countries have decided they don't want more of that. They want more self-reliance. China has the Made in China 2025 initiative, which is designed to build up China's productive capacity in a variety of manufacturing and technology sectors in order to reduce its dependence on others. Very explicit. And I think that's kind of what Trump is trying to do as well. He doesn't use that language. But lurking below the surface, I think, is a view among a lot of American elites that, it's time to build up their domestic capacity and maybe reduce. It doesn't mean you have to have tariffs and cut yourself off from world markets, but it just means the emphasis shifts from let's have more globalization to maybe saying, I think we got enough now, or maybe we want a little bit less going forward. And I think that's kind of where we're at. And we've had earlier historical cycles of that, going back 150, 200 years. So maybe there are some lessons from that. I haven't studied it closely enough to know, but it's kind of intriguing as a thought.
Now let's talk a little bit about ICBA members, people who are in the construction sector, builders, contractors, all sorts of different services. What are some things that they can do to deal with what's going on right now? Are there any strategies? Is there any advice, any words of wisdom that you
Sure.
can provide to some of the entrepreneurs and
Yeah.
business leaders?
I think I mentioned that I'm not a fan, and ICBA as an association, we are not supportive of Canadian retaliatory tariffs at kind of a 10,000-foot level. And we certainly aren't keen on seeing them applied to steel and other building materials, inputs that are used by the construction industry. So I think we need to be a voice, and we are doing this now, but we there's more. We may need, to step up our efforts in British Columbia and Alberta, which is where our members operate, with the national government in particular, in faraway Ottawa, to say, look, we don't support the idea or a policy of levying all these retaliatory tariffs. So we need to be lobbying against that idea, because there are others who feel differently about it. The steel industry in Ontario, for example, has been pushing quite hard for a lot of retaliatory tariffs, not just against the U.S., but others. So I think our industry needs to be alert to the risk that in a more protectionist era, we may see the federal government, because they're the ones with the power over trade, end up doing things that raise the cost of building materials, construction inputs. So we should be lobbying against that, and our members should be alert to that risk and be prepared to work with us and other trade groups to push back against those who feel differently, who actually want to see retaliatory tariffs. So that's one thing. Second, this moment in Canadian history where we're dealing with the Trump effect, as I call it, and people are saying, my goodness, we need to start investing and doing things in Canada. We need to build. Prime Minister Carney's platform is build, build, build. I don't really know what it means, but I like the idea. Trade corridors, critical more mines, more infrastructure, even pipelines, clean energy, the whole spectrum. If we're going to build more, obviously our industry is right in the middle of that. You don't build anything without ICBA members in BC and Alberta. So we should be advocating strongly to governments that now is the time to step up on big projects, on speeding up regulatory decision-making, getting rid of red tape. Canada, we've been mired in a mindset that puts a very high priority on process, not outcomes. And it's one of the reasons why we've been kind of limping economically. We're just not investing enough. It takes too long. And it's not just, LNG plants and new mines. It's everything. The Massey Tunnel here in BC, even public sector procurement on, hospital, school, everything. We should be looking to cut the time it takes to get stuff done and get things built. And that really falls on governments, primarily, because they're the ones who designed all these project assessment, regulatory, permitting processes that sort of pancake one on top of the other. And often they're adopted for good reason, but it's time to step back and look at kind of the cumulative burden. And ICBA, I think, can be a really strong voice for pushing governments in that direction. And now is the time to do it, because they seem to be thinking that way, thanks to Trump and the kind of challenging world we're living in. So that's a plea to our members. Work with us, put pressure on us, frankly, to get that message out there, because we can be a voice along with others to push the country forward at a time when we need some fresh thinking.
Final question. I know with all the tariffs kind of sucking up all the oxygen, and it's something that I'm sure you're getting asked about constantly, are there other economic forces, other things beyond tariffs moving in our world right now in Canada and beyond that you think builders should be aware of, be keeping their eye on, or that, that have caught your attention?
Yeah. Well, there are. Canada is interesting right now. So we've had very rapid immigration, very large immigration inflows since COVID, but it really started when Mr. Trudeau was elected 2015. He and his colleagues became convinced we needed to dial up permanent immigration numbers, which were then running at about 250,000 a year. So their policy, until just a few months ago, was to double permanent immigration from 250 to 500,000 a year. And then they really opened the doors to a lot of non-permanent, unprecedented inflows of non-permanent immigrants as well, students, also temporary foreign workers, and more recently asylum seekers as well from Ukraine and elsewhere. So we ended up, at the end of last year, we had 3 million non-permanent residents living in Canada. Those aren't permanent immigrants. That's a different group. But non-permanent immigrants, 3 million out of a population of 40 million. I mean, that's quite a few. 7.5% of the entire Canadian population. Now we've had a big shift in federal immigration policy, started under Trudeau, and Carney has confirmed it. And that's it. We're going to dial back permanent immigration from 500,000 to, let's call it 350 or 60,000, which is, it's a material reduction. And they're aiming to substantially shrink the population of non-permanent residents in Canada, by giving out fewer new visas, but also ensuring that people whose visas expire leave, which is not going to be easy to do. So for construction, this is quite a big deal because we've relied on population growth to drive the demand for a lot of construction services, housing. Obviously, the demand for housing goes up when you have more people, and the demand for public sector infrastructure, commercial buildings, retail space, everything is positively impacted if you have population growth. Now we're going to go through a couple of years with, if you believe the numbers out of Ottawa, no population growth. So that's going to be a bit of a short-term challenge. It's really a headwind to economic growth, and frankly, a headwind for our industry also. So we're going to have to manage our way through that. It's a temporary shift because it's only for 2 years, but it's an added challenge in this kind of challenging environment of the Trump era. So that's one thing that we're kind of monitoring carefully. Now, the economy has softened, the job market has softened, and unemployment is going up. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have less immigration for a couple of years, because you don't want to be, if your job market is weak and you got rising unemployment and young people coming out of school can't find employment, that's not a good time to be bringing in huge numbers of immigrants. So it's fortuitous in a way that the federal government's immigration policy change has taken place when it has, because it's makes sense to slow down on the immigration targets in this environment. The second thing we're looking at is climate policy, the so-called low carbon transition, and all the things that are happening in our own country at the federal, provincial level and locally around climate policy. So it includes fortifying the resilience of infrastructure so that we can withstand extreme weather events, flooding and things like that, because there seems to be, scientists think we're going to have more of that in the future. But it also includes dealing with our own emissions, even though Canada is 1.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. But we're under pressure, like others are, to get those emissions down. A lot of the pressure is internally imposed by our own governments. Now you've got Trump running the United States. He's abandoned the whole climate agenda that President Biden was advancing. He's pulled the U.S. out of the so-called Paris Agreement. He won't be doing any kind of carbon pricing, and he's rolling back a lot of the regulatory, or trying to roll back a lot of the regulatory and policy changes made under Biden and before him under President Obama, before Trump was first elected. So this creates a difficult situation for Canada because we want to be addressing our own emissions over time. I think most Canadians do anyway. But if the Americans are going to shift direction and not pursue an aggressive climate policy, to me, that requires Canada to step back and rethink what we're doing a bit. Because if we get too far out of sync with the United States, and some would argue we already are in some key areas, we will see substantial outflows of investment and production. And it's already been happening in energy and manufacturing. And when I listen to Prime Minister Carney talk, he wants to see the investment flows moving the other way. Well, if he does, I think that's going to call for some rethinking about Canadian climate targets. How realistic is it to dramatically cut emissions in a short period of time? We should probably be kicking that out. I would get rid of 2030 targets because 2030 is around the corner and we're miles away from achieving the 2030 emission targets that were legislated under Trudeau. And that tells me they're going to be harder and more expensive to achieve. Therefore, we should probably be putting some water in our wine and pushing out the deadlines, for doing that, especially at a time when the U.S. is kind of in flux on climate policy. So those two big sort of the second one is kind of related to Trump, but demographic change in Canada, the slowdown in immigration, and how we reconcile climate policy with the desire of a lot of our politicians to build and invest in our own country. I think those are two big issues that we're looking at ICBA.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. To the listeners out there, if they want to, how can they get involved in the ICBA?
They could join. If you're a company that's in or related to the construction industry, we're welcome new members. The membership fees are very competitive, and you get great services from ICBA. So get on our website and have a look there. We also have an employee health and benefits business that we run, not just for the construction industry, but for any industry any company that's looking to provide health and dental and extended life benefits, pension management for their workforce. So that's something we do as well. And so our website is there, and get on there and follow up with the folks whose emails are listed if you're interested.
Yeah, and go to readsitenews.com for more stories, more information, and more knowledge from people like Jock. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you.